Hey, what's going on, guys? TheHORRORman back with 21 horror movies every horror fan should own. Recently, some of my friends here on YouTube have been uploading videos discussing 21 movies everyone should own. I thought about filming a video like that as well, but as I was compiling my list, I realized I wanted to do something different. I thought it would be fun to discuss 21 horror movies every horror fan should own. After all, I am the Horror Man. The films I will be showing are not necessarily my top 21 favorite horror movies, although some of them would make that list. And they are in no particular order. These are simply, for one reason or another, the 21 horror movies I think every horror fan should own. I'm going to start it off with an obvious choice. John Carpenter's Halloween. It's pretty much universally known as one of the greatest slasher films of all time, and was very influential for slasher films that would follow. No horror collection is complete without Halloween. Next up is another infamous slasher film series, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Everyone knows Freddy Krueger. Even if you're not a horror fan, you know who Freddy is. And the slasher franchises continue with Friday the 13th, but I've opted to go with Friday the 13th Part 2 for this list. Here's the thing. As much as the original Friday the 13th is a classic, when people think of this series, they think of Jason. And despite Jason's brief appearance in the first film, we are introduced to him as the killer in this one. Friday the 13th Part 2 began Jason's reign, which continued throughout the rest of the franchise, with the exception of A New Beginning, of course. And despite being a sequel, because of the opening recap and the campfire story, Friday the 13th Part 2 can stand on its own, as opposed to other sequels. Not only that, but in my opinion, Friday the 13th Part 2 is the ultimate 80s slasher film. Next up, we have Tobe Hooper's classic, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like the first three films I discussed, everyone knows The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, whether you're a horror fan or not. And to finish off what are known as the Big Five, as in the Big Five slasher franchises, here's Child's Play. The list obviously needed a killer doll film, and Child's Play is clearly the most popular. While the previous five slasher films are often considered the Big Five, Scream is sometimes considered number 6 of the Big Six. This is the slasher film that revitalized the slasher genre, and it's the ultimate 90s slasher. As influential as Halloween and Friday the 13th were for 80s slashers, Scream was just as influential for the 90s slasher craze. But the film that influenced all of the previous is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Psycho is considered one of the first slasher films ever made, and this list obviously needed some Alfred Hitchcock. Janet Leigh may very well be the first ever Scream Queen, and her shower scene will be forever remembered. As we move past the most influential and most famous slasher films, we arrive at the Universal horror films. First up is Dracula. There needs to be a vampire on this list, and Dracula is the most famous vampire of all. We also need Frankenstein. If we're talking about Universal horror, you cannot leave Frankenstein off the list. It's the first monster movie, really, or at least the most famous. And rounding out the big three Universal monsters is the Wolfman, in what might be the most atmospheric horror film ever made. Here's my personal favorite horror film of all time, The Evil Dead. This movie is a shining example of what can be accomplished with a little budget but a lot of passion. It also gave us the horror genre's most famous final guy, Ashley J. Williams. It's funny that even as a final guy in a horror film, they had to give him a girl's name. From The Evil Dead to Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero's classic. What would the horror genre be without this movie? Think about the zombie craze over recent years, The Walking Dead, and more. Would it even exist without this film? Probably not. Every horror fan should own this movie, and every horror fan probably does, because it's on so many multi-packs. Typically, I would not include multiple films from the same franchise, but I'm making an exception here for Dawn of the Dead. Dawn of the Dead was, of course, the follow-up to George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which I just showed. Although they are very similar, they are also very different. I'd go as far as saying they are both equally as influential for the zombie genre. And Dawn of the Dead is one of the greatest horror films ever made, which is why it belongs on this list. Next up is yet another film by George A. Romero, written by Stephen King, Creepshow. Every horror fan should own a horror anthology film, and every horror fan should own some Stephen King. This gives you both. It's also the perfect example of what a horror anthology should be. A great wraparound story and 5 awesome segments. It's also important to own some Italian horror, and Argento might be the best of the best. This is Suspiria. Not only do you get a fantastic Italian horror film, but you get a story about witches, which none of these other films feature. Next up is The Exorcist. For the simple fact that many consider this to be the scariest movie ever made, The Exorcist belongs in every horror fan's collection. And then we have Jaws, another film people find to be genuinely frightening, probably because it can really happen. My thought? Stay out of the water. Regardless, Jaws is a classic, and it was a blockbuster for a reason. How about some sci-fi horror with Alien? Alien is sort of like Jaws in space. It's also sort of a creature feature slasher film. Unlike Jaws, however, maybe it's not as realistic to most of us, since many of us will never go to space. Even so, Alien manages to be truly scary. Like I said, it's a sci-fi creature feature slasher, and it's required horror. When most people think of body horror, they probably think of Cronenberg. But what about Clive Barker? Hellraiser is a prime example of his genius. It's a work of art. It also went on to spawn 9 sequels and an upcoming reboot. So yeah, I'd say it belongs in every horror collection. Here is a personal favorite of mine, Phantasm. Phantasm is probably the most unique horror film maybe ever made. It began what I truly believe is the most consistent horror franchise. There is probably no better horror series to marathon, because each film picks up exactly where the last left off. It's like one long, ongoing saga through 5 films. Whether or not it's a favorite of yours, like it is mine, Phantasm belongs in every horror collection. And the last of my 21 selections is Silent Night, Bloody Night. I started this list off with a Halloween horror film, a Halloween slasher to be specific, and I'm ending with a Christmas slasher film. When thinking of Christmas slashers, most would probably include Silent Night, Deadly Night, or Black Christmas. However, I've used the word influential quite a few times throughout this video, and I believe Silent Night, Bloody Night not only influenced Black Christmas, but it also influenced Halloween, the very same movie with which I started this list. Seriously, watch it and see why. Also, like Night of the Living Dead, most horror fans probably already own Silent Night, Bloody Night, because it's included on many multi-packs. I personally consider Silent Night, Bloody Night to be the most underrated horror film ever made, which is why I believe it is one of the 21 horror movies every horror fan should own. Well guys, that's my list. What do you think? Did I leave anything out? Comment below and let me know. Thanks for watching guys. Be kind, subscribe.